Once again, as we continue to have people rolling in, I want to welcome you that have joined us a little bit early here tonight. We're going to start promptly at 5. So thanks for being on time and even a little early. There will be dropping a link in the chat occasionally here. And once that link hits the chat, it's to a sign-in form. We'd invite you to click that link and sign in with your information so we can continue to communicate with you as the study moves forward. Also helps us with tracking for public involvement purposes. So watch for that link as it comes up. We have to drop it in multiple times as people continue to come in. So welcome. We've got everybody on mute for now, just to keep the chatter down to a minimum. But you should be able to turn your video on if you would like to, and take a look around, as it were. So we do got just a couple more minutes before we get started formally. I'll let you know also that we are live streaming this on the Heber Valley EIS Facebook group. If you have folks that aren't able to join via Zoom for some reason but are interested, you can point them to that in Facebook. And we'll also be recording the meeting tonight, so we can post that on the study website later on for review after the fact. So we'll give it another couple of minutes and I'll probably welcome a few more people. Welcome again. Some of you that have been on since we started admitting folks, we're going to get tired of hearing my spiel, but we want to make sure that everybody that joins gets a welcome to the meeting. We're set to start right at 5 o'clock, so here shortly. But as you wait, we wanted to make you aware that we'll be dropping a link in the chat that's to a sign-in form. If you want to take a minute while you're waiting for the meeting to begin to click over to that link and share your information with the team, we can keep in touch with you as the study moves forward, and it helps us with tracking purposes for public involvement as well. So the meeting is being live streamed on the Heber Valley EIS Facebook group. If you know anybody that would rather just kind of participate that way, you can point in that direction. And the meeting is being recorded so that we can post this meeting in its entirety on the study website later for later review. So welcome, and we'll get going here momentarily. Okay. Well, my computer tells me it's 5 o'clock, and we let everybody know that we plan to begin right at 5. Got a little bit of presentation to make, and then we want to reserve as much time as we can for some question and answer about this study. We want to welcome you tonight. My name is Justin Smart. I'll be moderating the meeting tonight. I'm with the study team, and we'll do introductions here in a minute. But want to just make a couple of reminders as we're getting going here. Some of you have heard this a number of times, those that joined us early, but we'll drop a link in the chat one more time for the sign-in sheet. We do that multiple times because those that join the meeting after the fact can't see what was posted before. But if you'll click that sign-in sheet link and share your information with us, we'll be able to keep in touch with you as the study moves forward. Also helps us with tracking purposes for public involvement efforts during the study. So if you can click over there and fill that in while you listen in, that would be helpful. Also, we want to just let everybody know that this meeting is being live streamed over to our Facebook group. That Facebook group is Heber Valley EIS. And so if for whatever reason you might get drop from the meeting and can't get back in, you can hop over to Facebook and view it there. We're also recording the meeting tonight so that we can post it on the website for later review for those that maybe missed the meeting or aren't able to join us tomorrow night. We are excited to have this meeting with you tonight. We appreciate your attendance and your interest in this study. As you've likely heard or read in the materials that have brought you here, the Utah Department of Transportation is doing an environmental impact statement for transportation solutions in the Heber Valley, and Craig will talk about that in a little more depth in a minute. But we want to welcome you here. My name is Justin Smart from the PI team for the study, and we want to take a minute real quickly right now and just orient you to who the study team is. And so I'm just going to run through them, and maybe those, when their name are called, they can give us a little bit of a wave here. You see Craig Hancock is our fearless leader. He is the UDOT project manager, and he'll be presenting the material tonight about the study and the alternatives that have been developed thus far. And then Jeff Dupay is the Region 3 communications manager for UDOT, and Region 3 is the area that covers the Heber Valley for the department. And then Naomi Kissen is here. She is an environmental program manager. And then we have members of the study team that work with UDOT. Vince Izzo is the Heber Valley Corridor team project manager. And then Andrea Clayton is our environmental lead. And Charles Allen is the lead traffic modeler and the one who leads that analysis. I'll already introduce myself, and then Brianna Binabuz is on the public involvement team with me. So we have a few other team members here with us, and maybe involved in the Q&A later, but that's the primary group that you'll probably see and hear from tonight and tomorrow, and then as the study moves forward. Now, I just want to, before we turn the time to Craig for the presentation, just want to walk you through a little bit of how the meeting will work tonight so that you can be thinking about how you might participate after Craig concludes. As of right now, we've got everybody muted just to keep the background noise to a minimum and keep the attention focused on the material that Craig will present. If you want to turn on your camera, you're welcome to do so for now. The chat's also turned off to, again, keep everyone focused on the information that Craig will share. But when we get to the end of the presentation and move to the question and answer period, just want to walk you through how that will work. All this information that I'm about to review is found in the participant guide, which is linked on the study website. And so if you want to review any of that, either while I'm talking or as the meeting moves forward, that's available there. We've had really great interactions thus far with the members of the Heber Valley community. That said, if somebody gets a little unruly, there is a code of conduct that we're going to kind of keep as the standard. And that code of conduct is found in a link that's just been shared in the chat. It's UDOT's social media policy participant code. And so anything that gets put in the chat later, or if as you're speaking, you do anything that violates that, we do have the opportunity to remove that comment from the chat and mute you and take you out of the meeting if needed. Certainly that's not anything that we've had to do, and our interactions thus far have been very cordial, but we wanted to just give you an idea of what kind of standard we're using for that. As we get into the question and answer, you'll be able to participate in a number of ways. So if you want to speak your comment, the platforms are different across, the Zoom platform is different across different devices, but there should be a raise hand feature. And if you click that raise hand, you'll come up to the top of our participant list, and that'll happen in order, and we'll be able to work our way through those who have raised their hands later in the Q&A. If you happen to be participating by phone, you can also raise your hand on the phone by dialing *9, and that will put you in that raised hands queue. And then if you'd rather not speak, but you do have a question, we'd invite you, when we get to that point, the chat will be open and you'll be able to chat in a question. We'll be tracking those also in order received. in a different document. Everybody will be able to view them, but we'll be able to kind of keep track of the order that we've received them in a different document. And we'll go alternate between those that have chatted in and those that have raised their hand and would like to speak. And we'll work through those back and forth as efficiently as we can. We're asking people to limit their spoken comments to 3 minutes, just so that we can move through as many questions as we can tonight. And then we also will ask people to limit their comment or their question to 1. If we happen to be able to get through all of the questions from everybody at least having 1 opportunity to pose a question, and we still have time remaining before our 8 o'clock close time, we will circle back and get any additional questions that we can. In your chat, there will be a number of names that you'll be able to chat to. Be aware that we want you to use the submit comments here name, which hopefully is self-explanatory. When you see that pop up, that's where you submit your question to. Let's see. The other thing that I want to just remind everybody of is tonight, we'd like this to be a Q&A format, so that we can, clarify any misinformation or misunderstandings that might be there, or additional information that you might need to submit a comment. But we would really encourage those that want to make comment on an alternative or a piece of the screening criteria or anything, to do that via the formal comment channels that we've designated. And we're going to put a link to the section of the study website where all of those channels are available. We have a website comment form there on the web. You can submit a comment via email, call us and leave us a voicemail, or if you'd rather write a letter and mail it in, that option's available too. And those means are there in the chat right now. So if, as Craig is going along, you have a hard time seeing anything or making out the detail of something, all of what's being presented via Zoom is available on the website also. So if you go to the website, there is a tab at the top that has the alternatives listed. And you just grab that alternative concepts tab and all that information is available there. One last plug for the sign-in request form. So Bree will drop a link in the chat for that sign-in request one more time. And if you joined us as I've been kind of introing the meeting, click that sign-in request and let us know who you are so that we can keep in touch with you as we move forward with the study. Okay, that was a mouthful. Once again, we want to thank all of you that have joined us tonight. And I think at this point, I will hand the baton to Craig to go through the formal presentation. And then keep in mind as we're going through, jot down questions you might have, and then I'll just refresh everybody one more time before we jump into Q&A at the end. So Craig, the floor is yours, and the team's going to mute and turn off their cameras.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Justin, for the introduction. Good evening. We appreciate you, like Justin said, we really appreciate you being here tonight. Hopefully our presentation is informative and you start getting a lot of your questions answered. And hopefully through the Q&A, we'll be able to answer a lot of those questions. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I will be presenting the alternatives that have been developed as part of this EIS impact statement. But I wanted to, before I jumped into all the different alternatives that we've developed, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about how these alternatives were developed, how we're going to analyze these different alternatives, and just talk about, in general, why we're looking at so many different alternatives. To begin with, I wanted to start with the project purpose and our purpose statement, as I'm showing up here on this slide. Probably the purpose statement is a pretty important place to start in the environmental process, in that it defines high level the goals of the project. It also helps us set a foundation for the alternatives that we're looking at, as well as provides a framework on how we evaluate each of the alternatives. For this project, the key driver is congestion on US 40. Today, we're seeing a fair amount of congestion on US 40. We expect that the congestion will continue to get worse as growth continues to happen in the Heber Valley and the Wasatch County area. So the purpose of this project is really framed around improving the mobility on US 40, as you can see in our statement here. Another key statement another phrase that we've added to this statement that may be new to some of you is that we've recently added a statement that where we're looking for this project to provide opportunities for non-motorized transportation. You may recall last spring, UDOT published our draft purpose statement for the public and agencies to comment on. Based on those comments we received, UDOT decided that we wanted to add a non-motorized transportation component to our primary purpose statement. What this basically does is it allows us to the final alternatives that we'll be looking at will include features that would help provide opportunities for people who are not using motorized vehicles. So we'll be looking at adding bike lanes or multi-use trails into the final alternatives that we'll be evaluating later on. So that's a new piece that we've added to the purpose statement. And finally, just as the last piece of our purpose statement, we want to make sure that whatever alternatives that we're looking at, that they allow for Heber City to meet the vision for their historic town center, and that we're not doing anything that would preclude them from being able to implement their vision. So that's kind of a high level on our project purpose. Next, I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about how our alternatives were developed for this project. First of all, we want to make sure that the alternatives that we develop address the project purpose that I just talked about, and specifically that the alternatives address making improvements to the mobility on US 40. Each of these alternatives have come from a variety of sources. Some of them have come from previous studies, some of the previous planning studies that have been done. Some of these alternatives have also come from some of the traffic analysis that we've done in our team. And some of the alternatives have come from comments that we have received from the public as well. We recognize that there are a number of ways that we can improve mobility on US 40. One of those ways is we can make improvements directly to US 40. And we have a number of alternatives that I'll be showing here in a few minutes that do that. Another way that we can make those improvements to US 40 is by building bypasses and then rerouting or routing traffic from US 40 onto those bypasses. And so I'll be showing alternatives that look at bypasses that are on the west side. We have also developed some alternatives that look at bypasses on the east side of US 40 as well. And then also we recognize that there another way to improve the mobility on US 40 to meet those project goals is through transit. So these are the different types of alternatives that we'll be looking at. Each of these alternatives that we've developed are high level. They're conceptual at this stage. And so as you look at these alternatives, recognize that that they are very high level, and we recognize that as you look at these alternatives that that you're going to have concerns, and that's to be expected. But we want you to know that we are following the NEPA process that requires us to look at a lot of alternatives. I know back in the scoping phase of the project, we were asked to take a step back and make sure that we took a look at all the alternatives, and that's what we're doing. We've taken a step back, and we are considering all the alternatives as the NEPA process requires. And as we follow the NEPA process, we believe that we'll be able to that will help us to make good decisions. And ultimately, our goal is to be able to evaluate those alternatives that meet the purpose of the project and are at the least amount of impacts to the environment. Next, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the alternative screening process and the steps that we go through to analyze each of the alternatives. This is a multi-step process, as this diagram here on the left is attempting to show. And as we walk through each of these steps, we begin to screen out the different alternatives. Right now, we are, excuse me, in step 2 of this process. It's the develop conceptual alternatives. That's why we're asking for that's why we're developing all these alternatives and asking for comments on the alternatives, just to make sure that we're considering everything that's potentially out there that could help solve the problem of congestion on US 40. Once we've gone through this comment period, we'll begin moving down into other screening steps. The next step we would look at is to look at each of the alternatives to see if they are technically feasible and if they meet the goals of the project. Those alternatives that are not technically feasible will get screened out, and then the remaining alternatives will then carry on into the next level of screening, which we call level 1 screening. It's at this stage that we begin to look at how well each of the alternatives meet the purposes of the project. This is a very objective view of analyzing the alternatives. We'll use our traffic modeling to see how well each of these alternatives help to reduce congestion and improve the mobility on US 40. At this stage, we'll also look at how well or whether or not they avoid or minimize impacts to the historic buildings on Main Street. And we'll also look for ways that these alternatives can provide the opportunities for the non-motorized transportation components as well. Any alternatives that do not meet the purpose and need will get screened out, will be eliminated from the alternatives. Next, we'll do some preliminary engineering. We'll develop a footprint for each of the remaining alternatives, and then we'll move into our level 2 screening. It's at the level 2 screening level where we begin to look at impacts to each of the alternatives. We'll be looking at impacts to some of our key resources. Some of those are Section 4F resources like public parks, and historic buildings. Other alternatives, other resources that we'll look at for impacts on would be wetlands. It's also at this stage where we'll begin to look at impacts to public or to properties. We'll look at some of those right-of-way impacts, and we'll also be developing a high-level cost for each one of the alternatives as well. Any of the alternatives that do not meet any alternative any alternatives that perform similarly with regards to purpose but have high impacts, those are the alternatives that we will at this stage screen out and eliminate from the process. So once we get through all these steps, we expect that we will be down to just a handful of alternatives that we'll then be able to further refine, and it's these alternatives that we will then take into a detailed alternatives evaluation in the draft environmental impact statement. It's at this stage where we'll further look at the impacts, especially the impacts to community resources. So we would be looking at this stage, we'd be looking at noise impacts or visual impacts. We'd also be looking at recreation resources as well, such as private subdivision parks and those kinds of things. So hopefully at this stage, you get a feel for how we go through the alternative screening process. There's a lot of information here, and it's fairly complicated. So I'd really encourage you to take some time to study this as you're looking at all the alternatives. That you also take time to study and understand how we go through and evaluate each of the alternatives. And if you have questions or comments on those, feel free to please let us know, and so we can get those comments and help answer those questions. So with that, I'm going to now launch into describing the various alternatives that have so far been developed with the project. As I alluded to earlier, we do have several groups of alternatives. The first group of alternatives that we're going to look at are those associated with US 40, making improvements directly to US 40. There are currently 6 alternatives concepts that would improve US 40. We've named each of these concepts 40A through 40E. The 40 in the alternatives name indicates the improvements that we are making on US 40. All 6 of these alternatives are shown in this figure. We wanted to highlight. We wanted to use this figure to highlight the different concepts, the differences and the similarities associated with each of these alternatives. But I'll be going through each one of these alternatives individually in the following slides. Just to help you get oriented to this figure, north is pointing to the right towards Park City. Just as a high-level comparison, all 6 of these alternatives start at about 500 North and Main Street and continue down through Main Street through downtown Heber and terminate here at about 1200 South. We've also included in this alternative different intersection improvements as well, and we've highlighted those with these little circles and diamonds or triangles. Sorry. In addition, we've also shown on this particular figure the various key resources that we're looking at as well in this initial alternatives analysis. So we've highlighted our wetlands, which are in green. We've highlighted some of the public parks in yellow, and then we also have red dots which highlight the historic homes. And each of these resources are other resources that will be used in our screening process. So the first alternative that we'll be looking at for US 40 is a widening of US 40. This concept would improve the mobility on US 40 by adding lanes to Main Street through the downtown Heber area from the 500 North down to the 1200 South area. Right now, US 40 has 2 lanes in each direction with a center turn lane for a total of 5 lanes, which we've depicted in this typical section here on the lower right. This alternative would add an additional lane, one for northbound, one for southbound, for a total of 7 lanes. Right now, we don't know how that widening would happen. We could be widening to the west, or widening to the east, or splitting the difference, and we'll figure that out as we go down, as we work through the process. Our next alternative is alternative 40B, which and for the next few alternatives, we're going to be looking at making improvements to the intersections of US 40. All the intersections on US 40 are expected to operate at failing conditions in the PM peak hour by 2050 if no improvements are made. So this concept would improve mobility on US 40 by making improvements to the intersections. This particular alternative does that by adding roundabouts to all the signalized intersections, and we're showing each of those with these green dots here on the graphic. With this alternative, we would not be adding any lanes to US 40, except we do expect to see that widening at the intersections where these roundabouts are added. But we wouldn't see any widening necessarily on the lanes themselves. So our next alternative is alternative 40C. With this alternative, we also make improvements to the signalized intersections as well. In this case, the improvements are made by adding turn lanes to each of the intersections. And once again, we've highlighted those intersections where the improvements will be made with these blue triangles. Also, with this alternative, we are proposing that SR 113 would be realigned to tie into Center Street, so that the main east-west movements would align at a single intersection. Currently, they're offset. There's an offset between Center Street and 100 South. So with this alternative, the signal at 100 South would no longer be needed. And once again, as we depicted on the cross sections on the right, we would not be adding any additional lanes with this alternative. So the next alternative is our 40D alternative. Another way that we can improve the mobility, the throughput on US 40 is by creating alternatives that would bypass all the intersections, either through the use of a tunnel, which we're showing here, or through the use of a bridge, which will be shown this typical here on the lower right side. With this alternative, Main Street would remain a 35-mile-an-hour facility to handle the local traffic at the ground level. And then the through traffic that's moving through Heber City would then be put through either the tunnel or the bridge at a 50-mile-per-hour speed. Okay, our next alternative is 40E. This is a reversible lanes concept. This is another way that we can manage congestion on US 40 through traffic management means. With this alternative, we recognize that that there's a strong directional split with traffic on US 40. During the evening, US 40 experiences a strong southbound direction as people travel from Park City down towards Heber City. We see a similar pattern in the morning as well, where there's more traffic heading northbound from Heber City towards Park City. Reversible lanes are lanes in which traffic can travel in either direction, depending on the time of day. So with this alternative, we would not be adding any additional lanes to US 40, but we would be utilizing the center lane as the reversible lane. So in the morning, the center lane would be used for northbound traffic during that peak period, and then in the evening, the center lane would be used for the southbound traffic as traffic moves back from Park City towards Heber City. With this alternative, left turns during those peak hours that are currently utilizing Center Street would not be able to be used. With this alternative, we use overhead signs with changeable lane control signals, which would indicate the direction of travel. We use green arrows and red crosses. With these signs, which we're kind of showing here on the right side, these sign gantries, and they would be placed about every 500 to 700 feet along the corridor. That's so that drivers who are driving through here can see at least two of these at any given time. And if you want to see an example of this, there is an example at 5400 South in Salt Lake County, which uses this system. So the last alternative on US 40 is a one-way couplet system. In this concept, that we would propose splitting US 40 into two one-way roads between 500 North to about 1000 South, with Main Street would be for the northbound travel and 100 West would be for the southbound travel. With this alternative, we would need to widen 100 West as we show here in this cross section here to add 3 lanes to 100 West. With the US 40, however, we would be able to actually reduce the width of US 40. Once again, taking it down to 3 lanes in the northbound direction. And we kind of show that here in this bottom typical section. So that concludes all of the alternatives for Heber Main Street. Next, we'll look at the west bypass alternatives. With this concept, we have 4 west bypass alternatives to look at. We've labeled these alternatives WA through WD, with the W in the alternative name to indicate a bypass on the west side. The primary difference between each of these alternatives is the speed limit and the number of connections that we make to the local road network. Once again, we're showing all 4 of these alternatives on this figure so that we can highlight the differences and the similarities. But I'll be going through each one of these individually in the following slides. Once again, we've oriented this slide with north pointing to the right towards Park City. A few things I'd like to point out here. First off, 3 of the bypass concepts, WA, WB, and WC, generally follow the corridor that has been preserved by Heber City and Wasatch County. And they all tie back to US 40 at about 800 north. The fourth alternative, WD, extends further north and ties back to US 40 at Potter Lane and at River Road. Also want to point out that the three concepts, WA, WB, and WC, have options that would realign US 189, but I'll first be looking at the option that leaves 189 in its current configuration. So let's look at each one of these. First one we'll look at is what we call alternative WA1. This is our west bypass limited access grade separated alternative. This is the highest speed west bypass alternative with the fewest connections to other roads. So this is basically a 65 mile per hour highway type facility. It's also grade separated, which means that traffic traveling on this bypass would not have to stop for the different crossroads, because we would be bridging across each of the crossroads. Connections to this bypass would be accomplished through interchanges. We have 6 interchanges with this alternative, and we've highlighted those alternatives with these orange circles. Couple things to point out with this alternative. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, this alternative does follow the corridor that was set aside by Heber City and Wasatch County. I also want to point out this gray area in the northwest quadrant here. At this location, because of the number of wetlands that we'll have to analyze and we're required to minimize or avoid, we haven't yet settled on any particular alignment through this area. The other thing I'd like to point out is this connection at 1300 South. This is a key connection for this alternative and the other alternatives that we'll be showing as well. The other 3 alternatives that we'll be showing, in that it draws, with this connection, we're able to draw traffic off of Heber Main Street and onto the bypass. Some of our preliminary analysis shows that these west bypass alternatives don't necessarily meet purpose and need without this connection. And then also with these alternatives, with some of our preliminary analysis, it looks like this bypass alternative would only need 1 lane in each direction, like we depicted down in this bottom cross section here on the right, with the exception of this segment between SR 113 and 1300 South, where we would need 2 lanes in each direction. So next we'll move to our WB1 option. This one is in terms of the alignment is similar to the previous alignment we just looked at, but with this alignment, the speed limit is much slower. This would operate at about a 55 mile per hour speed limit, and with this alternative, we would no longer the intersections would no longer be grade separated. Rather, all the intersections would be at grade intersection, meaning that the traffic that's traveling along the bypass would have to stop at intersections with other roads. With this alternative, we've identified 8 intersections that would intersect the bypass at grade, and we've highlighted those with these blue blue triangles. Similar to the other alternative, we have the 13th South connection, and also with this alternative, the bypass could operate well with one lane in each direction, as we're showing in the cross sections here on the right, with the exception of that segment between SR 113 and 1300 South. The next alternative is our WC1 alternative. This is our west bypass arterial at grade alternative. This is our lowest speed west bypass alternative, and it has the most connections to the local road network, which we once again highlighted with these purple triangles. This alignment, like the previous two alternatives, follows the same alignment, but the speed limit here would be at a 45 mile per hour speed limit. And like the other two alternatives, this bypass alternative would also function well with just one lane in each direction, with exception to the segment here in the middle from 113 to 1300 South, which would still meet the two lanes in each direction. So I've just reviewed option one of the alternatives, which leaves US 189 in its current configuration. We do have an option two that goes with each of these alternatives as well, which would realign US 189 like we've shown here in this graphic with this dark red line. With this option, traffic that's traveling north on US 189 would be rerouted to the bypass. And then this segment of US 189 that we're showing, that's this light red, could then be removed. We're looking at this option because it helps take more traffic off of Main Street, in that it would route all this northbound traffic coming from Provo onto the bypass. We know that there's been a lot of comments about the alternative of realigning a portion of US 189 because of railroad, because of the airport expansion. I just want to state that we are not looking at this option because of the airport. Yes, the airport master plan is a separate process, and the decisions that we're making as part of our environmental impact statement are independent of any of the decisions that we would be making, that the airport master plan would be making. So the last alternative that we want to talk about for the West Bypass is what we call the West Bypass Parkway with turbo roundabouts. Just a quick note that this figure is oriented with north pointing to the right again. This alternative does not completely follow the same alignment as the other previous alternatives that we just looked at. Here on the south end, it follows those alignments, but once we cross SR 113, this alternative would continue further north along 1130 West, and then would connect back to US 40 at Potter Lane and at River Road. The speed limit on this alternative would be 55 miles per hour. This alternative also implements a series of roundabouts called turbo roundabouts. We've highlighted those with these blue circles here in this figure. And just in case you're wondering, turbo roundabouts are a little different than the usual roundabouts that you see around Utah. with a turbo roundabout, these are typically multi-lane roundabouts where the drivers would need to select the proper lane that they enter into, depending on where they want to exit. So the driver therefore wouldn't need to change lanes once they've entered the roundabout. So they're a little more efficient that way and help reduce some of the conflict points. So with that does conclude all of the west bypass alternatives that we're currently looking at. Next, we'll switch to the east alternatives. Currently, we're looking at 3 east bypass alternatives. They're labeled EA, EB, and EC. Once again, we're showing all these concepts in this figure to be able to highlight the similarities and the differences. And I'll be going through each one of these alternatives individually here in a moment. The main difference between these alternatives, once again, is the speed of each of these facilities and how they make connections to the local road network. All of these east bypass alternatives generally follow the Heber City East Bypass roadway that is currently in process of being constructed in this segment north of Center Street. South of Center Street, we do have 2 different alignments. The EA alignment and the EB alignment are parallel 1200 east, but are just east of 1200 east. The third alternative, the EC alternative that we show here, would be on 1200 east. So let's look at each one of these individually. The first one we'll look at is the EA bypass limited access grade separated alternative. This is our highest speed east bypass alternative, and it has the fewest connections to other roads. On this facility, it would also be a 65-mile-an-hour highway type facility, where there'd be the way you would access this bypass is through interchanges. We have 3 of them identified, which we're showing with these red circles here. This alternative would use the east bypass currently being constructed north of Center Street as much as possible. However, the road that's currently being constructed is at a lower design speed. So as we go around this curve here, it does diverge from the current alignment that's being built, the current road that's being built. South of Center Street, this alternative would parallel 1200 east. It would be a separate alignment from 1200 east, but would parallel. Preliminarily, we've looked at it. It appears that this alternative would just need to be 1 lane in each direction, and that would be sufficient for this entire route. The next alternative is the EB alternative, and this is our East Bypass Parkway at grade alternative. This alternative would be at a slower speed at a 55 mile per hour. It would be more of a parkway type facility. With this alternative, the intersections would be at grade intersections. Right now we've identified 7 locations where these at grade intersections would occur, and we've highlighted those with the blue triangles. With this alternative, because of the slower speed, we have less of a divergence from the existing from the current road that's being constructed with this alternative. In this segment north of Center Street. With the segment that's south of Center Street, once again we follow a new alignment that's east of 1200 East. Preliminarily, it looks like the section that's south of 1200 South would, at one lane in each direction, would be sufficient to carry the traffic in this zone. But once we get north of 1200 South, we would need to go to a 2-lane section, which we show in this cross section here on the upper right. Then our final east bypass alternative is an east bypass arterial at grade alternative. This is our lowest speed east bypass alternative with the most connections to the local road network. With this alternative, the speed limit would be 45 miles per hour. And you can see all the different intersections that would be along this alternative that we've highlighted with the orange triangles. Preliminarily, this alternative would require 2 lanes in each direction for the entire route. It requires more lanes than the previous 2 alternatives because this alternative carries both the local traffic as well as the through traffic, which the other 2 alternatives we had those movements split. So with that, that does get us through all the east alternatives. The last alternative to look at is our transit alternative. Just by way of background, a transit study was prepared in 2020 to develop a vision and an implementation plan for public transportation in the Wasatch County area to address many of the unmet needs there. Some of the recommendations that came out of that study, first was to provide local service within the Heber Valley. Another recommendation was to create a commuter route between Park City and Heber. Another alternative was to create a commuter route between Wasatch County and Utah County. And then there was another recommendation that would create van pool services from Heber City to Orem and to Park City. Our transit alternative concepts are based on these recommendations. So with that, that does get us through all the alternatives that we are currently considering with the EIS study. Hopefully that was informative. I'm sure you have a lot of comments. And so I'm going to turn the time back over to Justin to talk through how the remaining rest of the meeting and the Q&A will happen. So Justin.
Thanks, Greg. We just want to spend one more quick minute talking through the next steps of this particular phase of the study. Tonight or today opens the formal public comment period on the alternatives. And that public comment period will extend from today through November 4th. If you want to throw up that next slide, Craig. And there, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, there will be many ways for you to submit those comments. If you visit our study site, hebervalleyEIS.udot.utah.gov, all of that information about how to submit a comment is there via email, via phone call, via a written letter. And what we're specifically hoping that you'll share with us are comments or information about each of these alternatives that Craig's just walked through that you want to make sure that the study team is aware of. Did we miss anything? Do you have other ideas that we need to add into the mix? Should we change a particular alternative one way or another in a way that would be more responsive to kind of the community and the natural and the built environment there in the Heber Valley? We would also love to hear from you about the screening criteria that we've talked about. Those criteria we're going to use to evaluate each of the alternatives, if you have thoughts about that. And other issues and concerns you have about things that we need to take into account as we move forward after the alternatives are screened down and we get into a more detailed analysis. Just a reminder that the public commenting process is not a vote. as part of NEPA, the process that we're following. So a comment that is, I don't like this alternative is less helpful than this alternative concerns me because, and fill in the blank of a particular resource in the community that might be impacted, or a particular need that's not being met, or a need that could be met if we adjusted it in a certain way. So the more detailed you can be, the better it helps us. If you want to go to the next slide, Craig, this is not the only opportunity for the public to learn about these alternatives. Obviously, these have been up on the website since Friday, but we're having the meeting tonight, and then there will be an in-person meeting tomorrow night held at the Heber Valley Elementary School. You can see the address there, and it will again be between 5 and 8 tomorrow. So there won't be a formal presentation tomorrow. It will be a true open house where all of the same information that we've reviewed tonight will be displayed. And these project team members that we introduced you to earlier will be there to answer any questions that you might have, or just engage in dialogue. Again, a reminder that questions tonight and tomorrow will be, it'll be a great opportunity to get those answered, and then we'll invite formal comment during the comment period through those means that I mentioned earlier. Also, this presentation tonight is going to be being recorded, as I mentioned earlier, and will be available on the website as well. So that's another opportunity for people to review the information. Finally, our just a project timeline and process overview. As you can see, we're there in the alternatives development phase of the process. And after this, we'll take the questions that come from this process, from the public comment period, the comments that are made, we'll digest those into how the alternatives are evaluated, and also the questions that come they'll be grouped, and we'll provide group responses to those in an FAQ document. And all that information will be posted on the study website. So with that, let's see. Those alternatives that pass through screen will be evaluated in further detail into the future. And then we'll move toward a draft EIS, a final EIS, and then a final EIS with a record of decision. So, and all of those stages will have accompanying public involvement, be they a public comment period or engagement with the public in some sort of open house format. So with that, I want to give everybody a quick reminder. We've had a number of folks join us since we started, and who may have missed how we're going to engage now moving forward into the Q&A. I appreciate that we've already got a couple people with their hands raised. That's one way that you can engage tonight, is to raise your virtual hand, if you will. You're going to be able to do that in a number of different ways depending on the platform you're on. But if you'll just raise your hand, we'll have you in a queue that will give you an opportunity. You're welcome to turn on your camera. You'll be able to unmute yourself in a minute, and you'll be able to speak your comment, and then the project team will have a chance to give you an answer or an explanation. There are a few of you that have joined on the phone. To raise your hand from the phone, you dial *9, and then when it's that will put you in the queue. And when it's your turn to speak, I'll recognize you, and to come off mute on Zoom, you need to dial *6. So even if your phone is on mute separately and you unmute, you'll still have to dial *6 to unmute yourself in the Zoom system. So be aware of that and kind of have that in the back of your mind if you decide to raise your hand and speak from the phone. And then finally, in just a moment, we'll open up the chat, and you'll be able to chat into, if you'll choose out of the options you have, submit comments here. Hopefully that's pretty explanatory. Chat in your comment to that person, and her name is Shelly. She's going to be aggregating those into a document that I'll use, and then read those comments and questions that come in so that the team can respond to those. So as we get in there, if we need to troubleshoot a little bit, we will do so. With that, I think if the project team wants to turn their cameras back on, and we'll move into the Q&A. We've already got a couple of hands raised. Let's just start. I don't have a written comment yet. So Justin Crail, you've raised your hand. And if you want to take yourself off mute, again, a reminder,
Yeah,
Just
I'm off mute. I just have a couple questions. What's the cost estimate for the Western bypass?
Right now, we haven't put a cost to any of the alternatives. They're at this point, they're pretty high level, and until we start moving through that screening process, we won't be developing a cost.
So the initial cost estimates I saw were at least $400 million. Is that not accurate?
Honestly, we don't know. I'm not sure how those costs were evaluated. Let me go back to trying to scroll back here to our.
Well, I think that would be a really important aspect of the EIS. If we're talking $400 million for a Western bypass and an Eastern bypass, I think that these are numbers we should be aware of.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't you?
Yeah.
And then the next question I had was, what is actually the no build minute delay from like 700 north to 1200 south of Heber Main Street? If I remember looking at your data, it was maybe 8 to 10 minutes for a no build delay. Is that correct?
I'm gonna kind of punt that question over to Charles, our traffic manager, to answer that question a little more directly. I do want to kind of circle back on Justin, on your previous question about costs.
Yeah.
We will have developed cost estimates once we get into the detailed alternative analysis.
Well, you see my concern here. I mean, if it's $100 million per minute delay, I mean, that's just absurd.
Right.
Wouldn't you agree? I mean, if it's an 8-minute delay from 700 north to 1200 south, and we build an $800 million bypass, it makes zero sense for the taxpayers. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think we'll want to.
Yeah.
I think we'll want to look at each of those alternatives.
I would too. Okay.
I just, if I could jump in and clarify. So I just wanted to make it clear that we will be developing cost estimates for the alternatives as we move through the screening process. So as you look at the slide that's being presented, cost is one of our screening criteria, and we will consider cost. We do consider it broadly, however, and so minor differences in cost wouldn't necessarily be a reason.
Yeah, but there's no way you guys can like present all these alternatives without presenting the public with actually the costs.
Yes, and we will be presenting.
We need a number assigned to it. Although people think it's UDOT or the state or whatnot, it's all our taxpayer money, and I'm just a big fan of being transparent with the money that we're paying to ruin the fields, so to say.
sure. So to clarify, costs will be put forth for the public in a future phase. And Justin, you've demonstrated a really good kind of pattern for us tonight. We want to make sure that we have opportunity to ask specific or answer specific questions. And then, it's clear that you have a view about the investment versus the benefit. And so that's the kind of thing that we would love to hear in a formal comment. So
yeah, you guys are great. And I really appreciate your willingness to listen to this, because previously a lot of us citizens didn't have the view that you were listening to it. And then also, I know I'm limited to one question. I want to identify how many historical sites on Main Street we're actually trying to protect, because our perception of Main Street, it's mostly car dealerships, gas stations, and whatnot. And Heber sees intention to preserve Main Street. I mean, in my recollection, there's maybe 2-3 blocks of Main Street we're trying to protect. And I don't think this justifies hundreds of millions of dollars in rerouting US highways to protect maybe 8 historical sites on Main Street. It is just not frugal to taxpayers. So if you could respond to how many historical sites on Main Street and the hundreds of millions of dollars of cost justification to preserve these handfuls of sites on Main Street and present that back to taxpayers. I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Okay, let's move to a Facebook question from, it looks like Daryl Bosshart, and I'm going to probably murder some names tonight, and I'm going to apologize in advance. But he states, if the goal is to just bypass downtown, East A seems like the fastest option for trucks and least intersections for accidents. If bypassing the whole valley for a longer term solution is the goal, Western D seems the best fit. Others seem too short-sighted, slow, or higher risk for accidents. So that's more of a comment than a question, but I appreciate that. And that's another example of the thing that the type of statement we want you to capture in an email to the team, in a, use the website comment form so that we can make sure that that official comment gets considered moving forward in the process. Let's jump over to another hand raised, Bob Kowalis. If you'd like to unmute and share your question.
Yeah, Justin, thanks a lot. Do you hear me?
Yeah,
we can. You may need to speak up just a little.
Okay, I'll get a little closer. First question is, how many bypass routes will there ultimately be?
So the bypass alternatives that we're showing right now are all the alternatives that we've developed thus far. As we go through this comment period that we're in right now, there may be others that show up, and we'll want to consider those as well. But the alternatives that I showed tonight are the full range of bypass alternatives that are currently being considered.
Okay, and I understand those can be modified. What I wanted to ask in that last question, when we're all through with this effort, how many bypass roads will be in place? Will there be one major bypass, or will there be an east and a west, Main Street included, or will there just be one route?
Right now, I'm not sure we can really answer that. That as we walk through the screening process, we'll be able to better get a handle on that. We are looking at, right now we are looking at an alternative, a single alternative that meets the purpose, meets the purpose of the project.
Okay.
I don't know if there's anything else that Andrea or Naomi want to add to that answer.
I'll chime in real quick. So in terms of what we're going to do here in this study process, we will identify one preferred alternative. So it could be one of the Western bypass options. It could be one of the Eastern options. It could be one of those US 40 options, or even potentially something else if someone brings that forward during this comment period. But when we get to the draft EIS phase, that we will identify one preferred alternative. That's how we propose to address kind of these needs that we have identified. Whether or not there are other facilities that are built in the future, that could happen, but the goal of this study is to identify one preferred alternative.
Thank you, Naomi. I think that answers that question. And if there's only going to be one, either I have misinterpreted or you see something I don't, but all east bypass options eliminate the 189 northbound traffic bypass capability. Did you realize everything eastbound comes off of Highway 40? That wasn't that tough now.
I'm trying to follow that your question there, Bob.
All eastbound traffic for your alternatives comes off of Highway 40, leaving northbound 189 with no bypass route. Unless they go up Highway 40 and backtrack.
So I'm trying to get to the right screen here, so bear with me a minute. So with each of these alternatives that we're proposing for the west bypass, let me make sure I'm understanding your question right. We have two options that go with those. One of them would keep US 189 in its current configuration. The second option would realign US 189 onto the bypass. And so we're looking at both of those different options.
Okay, that's fine. The westbound alternatives are fine. But if you go to eastbound, you'll notice that all the eastbound alternatives are coming off of 40, and we're not addressing traffic coming north on 189 with all of the eastbound bypass.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Craig, you could answer that.
Yeah, go ahead, Vince. Yeah, I understand his question now, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Vince.
So yes, you're correct. And that's part of the thing that we'll be looking at in the screening process is how well either the west, east, or middle US 40 alternatives meet the purpose and need criteria. So those are things that will be considered when we do the travel demand modeling and how it impacts traffic and what traffic uses a route. So those are things that we'll be considering.
Okay, thank you so much. Those were my questions. You've given me answers.
Thanks, Bob. I want to just note that we're being a little bit flexible here. We did ask folks to limit themselves to one question, but we've only had a couple of people chime in vocally so far, and we've had just the one statement come in via Facebook. So if you have a question, again, find the submit comments here in your chat box and type it in, and I can read it out for everyone. Or if you'd like to raise your hand virtually and get in the queue to ask a question. I can see Trudy actually. Are you trying to raise your hand for real and chime in? Let's see. I wonder if we can get you off mute. I've asked you to unmute. There you go.
Okay, thank you.
We can hear you now.
It. Yeah, I have two questions, but you can limit me to one if you want. One is, how did the Western routes arise? It was my understanding that for many years, a route that was meant to bypass Heber City and would begin just north of 500 north in Heber, the options A, B, and C, that those were being planned. And then now suddenly we have D. How did D come about? Who was pushing that? Where did it come from? That's my first question, because all of these, I'm assuming, the ones that were planned for a long time, governmental agencies may have been acquiring land for those, right?
Right.
So that to enable that bypass. But D is brand new. It would require acquiring a lot of land through the North Fields. And that brings me to my second question. You're aware that the North Fields has received a lot of attention, including a referendum, to protect it. What types of considerations, environmental and otherwise, would you give for running a highway right through the North Fields?
I'll attempt to answer your first question, Trudy, and then maybe I'll turn the second question over to Naomi or Vince or Andrea to answer. To your first question, part of our public process last spring was to asked the public if there were any other alternatives that we needed to consider as part of our alternative analysis. The WD alternative did come forward as one of those alternatives from the public, and so we felt like it was important to incorporate that in and consider it right along with the other alternatives that we're considering here. So it came from a member of the public.
Okay.
So with that, I'll kick it over to a member of our team to kind of answer your second question.
Okay.
Is that something, Andrea, you'd like to weigh in on?
I can take a stab at that. So the question was, how would we be able to justify or consider a west bypass when there's so many natural resources in the North Fields and there's a referendum to protect them? That's my understanding of the question. So
yes, and also because the city has been planning on options A, B, and C. Everyone was assuming that was going to be the route. So,
sure.
It would require a whole new approach, condemning tons of land, changing the agricultural aspects of the North Fields and the future of the North Fields.
So I do understand your question, and I'll break it down into two parts. The first part is that we will have to consider and evaluate impacts to resources with any of the alternatives, whether it be an east bypass or a west bypass. And there's two different stages when we'll be doing that. The first stage is in level 2 screening, which is where we'll be looking at key resources to evaluate whether there are alternatives that should be eliminated because they have too many impacts to resources and don't provide as much benefit. And one of the resources that we'll be using for level 2 screening is waters of the US, which includes wetlands, creeks, ditches, and canals. And so we recognize the importance of that resource. That is why it's being a level 2 screening. And then there will be a second stage when we look at the impacts in more detail. For all of the alternatives that pass all the way through the screening process and are looked at in detail, then we'll do a more robust analysis looking at a wider array of impacts to resources, and they would include visual impacts, impacts to open space, agriculture, farmlands, etc. And so the answer is that we do need to look at these impacts, and the impacts will be important in the consideration of screening and selection of the preferred alternative. And going back to what Craig's response was to the first part of the question is that WD does look different from the alternatives that are WA, WB, and WC based on the corridor that's been preserved by Heber City and Wasatch County. And that alternative was brought forward by a public comment. So we are required as part of the NEPA process to evaluate it because it could be a reasonable alternative, and we'll have to look into it, consider the impacts, and determine that. Does that answer your question?
I have lots of questions. We could go on, but I want to give other people a chance to answer questions. Thank you, though, very much for your answers. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Trudy, for your patience. And if we have time, we can circle back to you. On the written side of things, I just want to throw out, we kind of got a second to the comment I read earlier about East A being a fast option. Western D might be the best fit given a different circumstance, but others seem short-sighted. So it's a verbatim comment as well. We did have a question come in on the chat. I'm just going to read it out. Is it possible to do concept pictures of what a bridge or tunnel would look like on Highway 40 so that the public can actually picture what Main Street and the downtown would look like with both alternatives? The slide doesn't show a visual of what the option might entail. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. And maybe Andrea, you can chime in on this, but it seems like we've done these kinds of visualizations in the past.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So as I mentioned in the last answer to a question that Trudy raised, is that for the alternatives that pass through the screening process, there may be a handful of them that we look at in detail. And visual impacts is something that we will be considering for those alternatives that that pass through the screening process. And so if by chance a bridge or a bridge concept is one of those, then we would certainly develop a visual simulation to show what it would look like. If it doesn't make it through the screening process, then we will not do a visual rendering because it will be eliminated before we look at it in detail.
Thanks, Andrea. Okay, we've got Kay Sigurd, who has been waiting patiently with their hand up. Would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
I'm guessing that none of you know where the temple is going to be that was just announced. How much impact do you think that would have once they announce the place?
You're correct. We have no idea where the temple will be placed. And so, you know, it's hard to say at this stage what kind of impacts that would be on the overall transportation network. I don't know if there's anything else Charles or anybody else would like to add to that, but yeah, right now we really don't know what that would look like, not knowing where the location is.
Yeah, Craig, I just second what you said. Without knowing where it is, it's hard to know if it'll even be impacted by this project or what that impact would be.
Yeah.
Andrea, is there any additions you'd like to make in terms of what kind of how that would be considered as a resource if it happened to be placed close to an alternative?
Well, I think if we know what the location is when we're evaluating alternatives in detail, then it could be considered in a variety of ways. We do look at social and community impacts. And so for community buildings and facilities, schools, churches, things where groups of people would congregate and gather, we look at those and how they would be impacted if there were an alternative that were to either go through the site or cut off access to the neighborhoods that access them. So I guess I can just leave it at, if we know where it will be, we can evaluate what the impacts could be for the alternatives that make it through screening.
Excellent.
So Justin, if I may, just to clarify or just to reaffirm, if a location is identified during the study process, we will definitely take a look at that. At the same time, you know, because we don't know a time frame, we don't know a location, it's difficult to predict at this point in time what those impacts would be.
Great. Thanks, everyone on the team. We do have a few more written questions rolling in. So I'm going to move over to a written question again. Holly Alden via the chat. I've seen other small towns with one-way routes through the city, which is charming. Any consideration of a hybrid solution to utilize an east bypass and also a one-way method using both Main Street and 100 West? So it sounds like this kind of goes to the question earlier about how many alternatives might be used. So any thought to that from the team?
I'm gonna once again kind of turn this one over to Andrea to address how we would be considering different alternatives, multiple alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say that these alternatives may change a little bit as we get more into the details and develop them further. But as Naomi stated earlier, our intent is to identify a single preferred alternative, and it may have some elements from one alternative and some elements from another alternative. But the process would get really messy if we were to try to open it into too many alternatives. And so I think if we're focusing on a west bypass, it's probably going to be a west bypass. Improvements to 40 would probably be improvements to 40. And I am not sure that I don't know that we know enough to say that it would never be a combination of all three, but it's likely to just be one or the other. And I would invite anybody else on the team to add to that in case they have a different answer.
This is Vince. I mean, if that's a suggested comment or an alternative, please provide that, you know, could you look at maybe a scaled down east or west bypass along with the one-way couplet, and would that solve the problem? And yeah, I think if we could then take a look at that, if that's something that the public is interested in us taking a look at.
Thanks. Bob, given that we've already heard from you, we do have some new questions that have come in on the chat. So I appreciate you through a couple of these more questions on the chat. Well, actually, I'll take one and then we'll hop over to Kate, who we haven't heard from. So Luke Searle, and this sounds like maybe it's a question up your alley, Charles. He says, tell us more about what you found about potentially adjusting Highway 189 as part of the Western alternative concepts. I'm assuming he's meaning what you found in terms of traffic and how the traffic would flow.
Yeah, it sounds like the question is, we have some alternatives where there's an option to realign a portion of US 189 as shown on this diagram, and what sort of benefits we're seeing. First of all, I'll say the analysis so far is very preliminary, but results that we've looked at and from previous studies suggest that creating really a realignment like this may pull additional traffic off of Main Street, so providing additional relief to congestion. How much exactly that is, that's something we're going to take a closer look at as the study moves on and see if it's enough of difference from other alternatives that it provides a significant benefit to Main Street.
Thanks, Charles. Any follow-ups from the team on that answer? Okay. Kate, your hand raiser we haven't yet heard from. Would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, hi. For the bypass, there, e-biking, walking along, between Heber and Midway, those are very popular biking routes, walking routes. How will you, safely ensure that we're not dealing with another Main Street, but between, the two cities, to kind of maintain that visitor local feel, biking around in this valley?
Yeah, good question, Kate. Thanks for asking that. We have included the non-motorized option into our purpose, and our goal there is to develop a facility that would help promote the non-motorized, the cyclists and the walk and the pedestrians. At this stage, we're not going to be developing any specific facilities until we get through the screening process. At that point, we'll begin to take a hard look at what kind of facilities we would be adding to the alternatives. Certainly, we'll be looking at building facilities that are safe and can be utilized, and if there's and make connectivity to the broader pedestrian and cycling network. I don't know if there's anything else anybody would like to add to my comment from the team.
Okay. We've got another question from the chat from Nicholas Chop. And I'm sorry if I didn't speak that well. It says, have you looked at how much traffic comes from west or east? Maybe this is another one up your alley, Charles. It would seem that most traffic comes from the west, and therefore we should try to bypass from that direction, as a question.
Okay. Yeah, so I think the question, when you mean west or east, I'm guessing you mean either coming from 189 or coming from US 40 from the Daniels Canyon area. And the answer to that is, when we're talking about through traffic on Main Street, there is more total traffic coming from 189, there's more trucks that come from 40. So those overall patterns are something we are definitely going to be looking at and seeing how effective the west bypasses versus the east bypasses are at relieving congestion on Main Street.
Nick, since this was your question, it looks like maybe you've got a kind of a clarification. Go ahead and come off mute, and then maybe Charles can answer it a little more fully.
No, I think that helps answer my question and just raises a concern through, the east side of town, is primarily residential neighborhoods that the big trucks would be then going through at speed. So I hope that would be a part of a consideration ongoing, because that is a large truck route.
Thanks, Nicholas. We've got a few new hand raisers as well. So let's go first to, I believe Margaret Gooch was next in line. And Bob, again, we appreciate your patience. We're trying to get through those newcomers first. So Margaret.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Hello, my name is Margaret Turner Gooch. I was born and raised here. I'm 75. I've heard this bypass talk for many, many years on and off. I'm curious, how long is this project going to take? I mean, all these different segments. I was at a meeting at the library maybe 3 or 4 years ago when you guys had all the stuff up on the walls and you were proposing different bypasses then. And so here we are. How long is all this going to take? And then tell me about trucks. Trucks are going to be able to go around those roundabouts? Just curious. That's my question.
Thanks, Margaret.
So to answer your question, Margaret, get back to our schedule, the last slide here. So the current timeline for the EIS, and this is a big step forward in the overall process of things. We've done a lot of planning studies in the past, but the investment that we're making now in developing a preferred alternative and going through this EIS process is a big step forward. Although right at this moment where we're looking at a whole bunch of different alternatives, it may not seem that way, but it really is a big step forward. In terms of the timeline for the EIS, we are in this alternatives development process, and then we will move into other phases of the project as well. But it will take time, and so we really don't expect to have a final EIS document and a record of decision until the spring of 2023. At that point, we hand off at that point we'll have an alternative, a preferred alternative identified and a project identified, and at that point it kind of leaves our hands and goes to public officials and others, where they'll begin figuring out how to advance that project even further into a more of a design and construction phase, and we can't really say at this point how long that would take. But our goal right now is to get through this very significant step and get an environmental impact statement and a record of decision.
Would somebody like to also speak to the second part of her question about trucks and the roundabouts? Charles, I saw you came off mute.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. The roundabouts can be designed for heavy trucks to go through them. Like regular intersections, they're going to go through them more slowly than other vehicles, and they may have to swing wide through some of the approaches or through the roundabout circle itself. But that's something we're going to make sure we're considering and calculating in detail how well those roundabouts perform with the amount of heavy trucks that exist on Main Street today.
Thanks, Charles and Craig. Let's see. I think that we're back to a typewritten question. This one from Dahlia Gonzalez. also about the temple. When will the location of the temple be released? I think I can pretty safely answer that one, is that we don't know. But maybe we can keep public input open until after it's released. Craig, would you like to field that one?
Sure. With really not knowing what the time frame is at all with the temple and the process that they're on, we do want to we want to keep this process moving forward, and as we've shown the timeline here. But if it does happen while we're in this process, we can certainly pause and consider what if any impacts that would be to the process we're dealing with right now.
Thanks, Craig. I think we are back to Sue Ellen Weiniger.
Yeah, I just had a question. Thank you. In all the traffic studies that you have conducted, what was the percentage of through traffic versus lower local traffic on Highway 40?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Would you mind answering this one?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's difficult to know precise numbers, but from what we can gather, there's a greater amount of local traffic than pure through traffic, meaning people starting outside of Heber and continuing through Heber, and their destination is outside of Heber somewhere else. There's a lot more local traffic than pure through traffic on the corridor.
That was my recollection as well from prior meetings. So I'm just struggling a bit with the concept of putting a highway that even considers putting also overpasses through the North Fields in order to accommodate that small percentage of through traffic. Because, and I remember we were all shocked. I know I can't be the only person who was shocked to learn that when you counted the number of semi-trucks versus, the lorries and then the pickup trucks and the personal vehicles, really it was the personal vehicles and the personal trucks that were the vast majority of the traffic, which was shocking because I think we're also, sensitive to the trucks because they're the noisiest and the biggest and they seem to have the biggest impact. But it just seems a little bit, I'm incredulous that we're actually considering putting a highway where you might have traffic limits of 65 miles an hour going through the pristine, treasured North Fields just for that small percentage of traffic and for the trucks. I've driven on Highway 40 at 5 p.m. weekdays, Friday afternoons. My delay was practically nothing. And I'm just shocked that we can't just adjust our lives a little bit and maybe not, adjust our schedules a bit. If that's a problem, go at a different time, but we can wait a little bit in our traffic. I don't feel like we need to destroy the North Fields because people can't wait 5 minutes. But
thanks, Sue Ellen. We appreciate your comment. Make sure that we capture that in a formal comment. Anyone have a response that they'd like to make?
No, I would just add to that, Justin. That's a great comment, and Sue Ellen, and please make those comments to us so we can capture those.
I will, and I just say one last thing. I was kind of curious. You said that WD, or not WD, yeah, WD came from a member of the public. Were there numerous members of the public that had that idea of starting the bypass at River Road, or was it just one person? Because I know I made a lot of comments and suggestions that have not entered into any of these proposals in my comments, but maybe were there several of these people that were proposing the WD idea, or was it just one?
I don't know. Maybe Andrew, you can speak to that. I know it came as one fully developed alternative. I'm not sure how many, if it was one person representing a group of people, But it was a fully developed alternative that came forward.
And I'll add to that. It was a fully developed alternative, and there were a few people that commented that they were in support of this alternative as well. And then, Suellen, to your comment that you had submitted some comments on alternatives that you aren't seeing here today. We did try to get all of the alternative suggestions from the public into these concepts. But if you feel like we've missed something that either you did comment before or you didn't comment before, we would like to hear about ideas that we could add into our toolbox, or we want to make sure that before we go into the screening process that we've got all of the reasonable alternatives to begin with. So apologies if we missed something you submitted before, please submit it again.
Okay, so we're going to go back over to the written comments or written questions. We received a question from Brady Flagare. He says, is there anywhere else similar to Heber Valley that the turbo roundabouts are used? I like the concept, but they seem impractical for towing trucks in this climate, snow.
So I believe we do have some links to a website that FHWA has produced, and also another website from the creator of this one as well. I don't know. Can we post those links on our website, Andrea, so people can see that? We're not aware of any turbo roundabouts locally or in the Utah area. But I thought that these couple links did a nice job in explaining what these turbo roundabouts are and where they're being used. I think they're used a lot in Europe, but I'm not aware of. I'm not sure if there's any that are being used anywhere else in the country, in the U.S.
Okay. I know that we've had a couple of folks raise their hand and then lower them, or some newcomers. But since John is still kind of in line here, John Scheid, would you like to lower your hand and speak? Maybe let me see if I can ask you. Have you been able to come off mute?
Okay, can you hear me?
There we go. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. A couple of comments. One on your eastbound route that I saw, the third one that you listed there where it had all the stops. I'm not quite sure why somebody coming up 189 would want to jump around and get over on that, or coming down 40 would want to jump off of 40 to go on that, where you got to make 13 stoplights versus the 3 or so that you got going through the center of town. The other one is your route coming up 189 or coming over towards the east side. You'd have to go quite a ways down the road going up Daniels Canyon before you can jump onto that bypass. Whereas I see on some of your other alternatives on the west side, it looked like they had a shorter route to get back over towards 40. I don't know if you can address that or not, but it seems to me that if you're thinking about somebody driving through town, if they know that they've got to do 13 stoplights, especially the trucks, if they know they got to do 13 stoplights coming around on the East Alternative C, versus the going through Main Street, I think they pretty much jump on Main Street and stay there.
Craig, this is Vince. I can take that.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's something what we're going to be evaluating during the screening process, is taking a look at each of these alternatives and seeing whether they actually work or not. So we just got this list of, here's something we want you to look at. And so we're looking at all those. And then in this process that we're working on, we will determine whether it alleviates traffic or not, and whether having all those stoplights on the east side would work, because maybe the modeling would show that people wouldn't take it, and so that alternative would be eliminated. So that's this step of the process that we're working on over the next few months, is to evaluate how traffic is affected by each alternative.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, John. We have a new written comment here from Nick Lopez, came in via Facebook. It says, currently US 40 and Highway 189 have become head-on highways with multiple fatalities. There seems to be a lack of urgency in making safety improvements like center dividers on both highways and adding additional travel lanes on 189 around Deer Creek and US 40 south of 189 to Daniel. Until a bypass route is chosen and constructed, what is UDOT's plan for improving the safety of 189 and US 40 coming into and through the Heber Valley? I know that Charles and his team did some safety analysis on various routes. Sorry, Craig, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's a great question. We are looking at the safety issues that you've pointed out on 189 US 40. We do have some projects that are currently funded to help improve some of those roadways. One of those is the widening of US 189, that segment just south of Charleston as you enter into the Provo Canyon. That project has been funded, and we'll be starting to develop some design plans for that one and do some construction there. We are also looking at making improvements on 189. I guess would be north of the Charleston intersection as well, looking at possibly some safety improvements there as well. And then we also have another project in 2000, and I think funding comes in around 2008 to do some widening on US 40 there, coming out of Daniels into the Heber area. So that we do have a lot of plans out. We do have plans out there to address some of those issues. That will come as projects, as the funding is available.
Thanks, Craig. I want to take a quick mention of a couple of resources that have been posted in the chat. And then we don't have any new written comments or hand raisers. And so as soon as I get done with this chat mention, we'll come to you, Bob, and then I'll read another question from Dahlia. But over here in the chat, for those of you who are interested, Sue Ellen talked about comments made previously. There's a link here to a summary of comments from previous phases of the study. There's also a couple of roundabouts that speak, or roundabouts, excuse me, a couple of links that speak to the roundabout discussion that we had a couple of minutes ago. There's some information from Federal Highway Administration about turbo roundabouts. And then there's another link. They may actually point to the same resource now that I'm looking at it. They just got posted by two different people on the team. We're exceedingly helpful here, apparently. But pick whichever of those two links you like, and I think you get to the same place. Let's see. So Bob, you've been extremely patient as we've worked through some of our newcomers. You're a second time arounder. Would you like to come off mute and ask another question?
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been informative so far. Let me preface my question with this key term. It said a parkway is a controlled access divided highway with few intersections and a median in the center. I wondered if you could look at westbound B as in boy and let me know whether bypass parkway is appropriate for that definition, or would it be better as a bypass arterial? I think it all has to do with the intersections in both, and definitely westbound B has too many intersections to be a good parkway. And it might be well to change that terminology so we don't look at it as westbound D is in dog.
No, that's a good comment, Bob. I think we can certainly look at that. We feel like the cross section here fits at least our definition of a parkway. But if there's modifications that we can make to it, certainly we'd be open to doing that. I don't know if there's anybody on the team that could specifically address the standards that we followed in developing the parkway cross section that could add to that. But no, that's a great comment, Bob.
This is Andrea. I can add just a little bit. I think that different people have different definitions of what a parkway is. And I don't know that there's one right answer to that. But it is a good comment on the number of intersections. That's something that we'll be looking at through traffic analysis. And I did want to just call out that WC is an arterial at grade. It does have a different cross section, but we have an alternative that's pretty close to WB, but it's slightly different without the median and with I believe just one more intersection.
And Bob, I just wanted to clarify, you said D as in dog, correct? So you were talking about the turbo roundabout alternative.
D as in dog is a true parkway based on your key terms. And I just compared the key terms with the westbound B as in boy. And really it's not a parkway, it's more like a bypass arterial, more like a main street, because you've got all the intersections coming across it.
Okay.
It's not a biggie. I mean, it's just something that if you change the terminology, you won't look at it as a high-speed parkway. You look at it as a slow-speed main street.
I just want to clarify, I guess, Bob, with I guess the speed that we have on the WD alternative also is a 55 mile an hour, is also at a 55 mile an hour speed limit as we show it here. And it does have a number of at-grade intersections where those turbo roundabouts are being utilized. And then I think if we go back to the WB alternative, it similarly has a similar speed of 55 mile an hour. And I think it has a similar number of intersections as well. So I think we're fairly consistent there, but you know, we'll definitely take a look at it and make sure that we are consistent in that terminology.
Thank you. That was probably an inconsequential question, but I just thought I'd bring it up. Appreciate your time.
Sure.
Thanks, Bob. We have Kalisha ready to speak. Just a general reminder for those who want to speak, if you'll stop, we're recording the meeting, so we want to make sure that everybody can make out the questions and comments that are made. So Kalisha?
Yeah, so I have a question about the eastbound option. So there's 3 different options there. The one that was going to be going, I think it was 65 miles an hour. I just know that road, Mill Road, it just has a lot of entrances and exits, and also 2 major schools there that have a ton of traffic going in there. So I'm just curious what it would look like. Is it going to be something where they're going to do a bunch of overpasses, or I'm just trying to visualize how that would work over there.
Sure. Let me kind of explain that a little bit better. So our east bypass limited access one, the highest speed alternative is a new alignment. It's not on Mill Road or 1200 East. It actually runs parallel to it, but still a little bit further east. It is a grade separated facility, so that the local roads would either bridge over or go under this alternative. And there would be the connections that we pointed out here with the with the interchanges at the 3 locations, the one connection here at US 40, the one up at Center Street, and then the other one on the north end of US 40. So the local road network would not have access to this alternative, but rather this alternative would bypass all those local roads.
So really, the traffic would be coming off of Highway 40 closer to Daniels Canyon, but it wouldn't have any of the traffic from 189. Is that right?
Yes, as we're showing it here, that's correct.
Okay, so and then with the westbound, is it the same kind of thing that I think it was westbound A or W or 40A? That one is the 65 mile an hour. Is that the same kind of thing where it would either go above, over intersections or under?
Yes.
And just be okay.
Yeah, very similar idea.
Okay. All right. And then with this process, is there going to be, I saw on your timeline, there's going to be a further the ability to have public comment when you get further in. I think it was in the summer of 2022. Does that mean that changes could be made then when you guys narrow things down more? Would we be able to have even more of a say of what happens?
Maybe I'll turn that over to maybe Naomi to discuss a little bit more about that public process as we move further into the process here.
Sure. So after this, we'll go back to work essentially at further developing the alternatives following that screening process that there was that kind of funnel diagram of. And then those alternatives that make it through that level 1 screening, so they meet the purpose and need of the project, and also make it through the level 2 screening, which is for those kind of critical resources. We will analyze those in detail, and the draft EIS will show the results of that analysis. In that draft EIS, we will also identify what is our preferred alternative. And the public will have an opportunity to comment on the draft EIS in general, our analysis, but also the preferred alternative or any other kind of any other thing that is contained in that document. So it'll include a summary of all the activities we've done, the alternatives that were dismissed and why, and then that detailed analysis of the ones that were carried forward. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. And so it's not a final draft.
No,
it's
so
more...
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
So after the draft, we basically take all the comments that we received during that process. We release the draft, we get the comments, and then we take those comments and we use those to essentially produce the final EIS. And the final EIS, as noted on the schedule, will be released simultaneously to the record of decision. And the record of decision essentially is what we call the decision document. It basically says this is what the decision that we're making. So the comments that you give to us during the draft will be used to essentially revise the EIS and produce the final EIS that will be issued simultaneous to that record of decision.
Okay, and so right before when you said all the comments submitted, that's in the summer, or is that right now?
That's in the summer. So this is a different comment period. So essentially
that's
summer,
what
fall, right. So that will be the next kind of big opportunity for.
Okay, yeah, that answers my question. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And I'll note for Kalisha and others in the chat, Bree has posted a link to a video that UDOT has put together about the NEPA process. It's about 7 or 8 minutes, but it kind of goes through step by step how this will unfold and the public comment opportunities along the way. Mary Hawkins, you have been waiting patiently as well. Go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, thank you. One of the questions caused me to wonder about, in order to incent traffic off of 40 through town or your main street, Is there thought to then either lowering the speed or barring truck traffic during certain hours of the day, or providing any other kinds of sort of enforced incentives so that your bypasses are used?
Generally speaking, we really don't look at those kind of incentives or disincentives, I guess how you look at it. Our truck traffic is because this US 40 is a national US route. They have the right to use the road just like the rest of us do. So, you know, our goal here is to incentivize the use of the bypass routes by making them, you know, more appealing to use, which, you know, we'll look at as we go through the traffic analysis. I don't know if there's, Charles, if there's anything else you want to say there or correct what I'm saying.
No, I don't think there's anything else I'd want to add other than these alternatives are defined as, you know, building additional roads or changing existing roads. And they don't go into detail about policies like, you know, restricting certain types of vehicles or lowering speed limits.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. We have another question that's been submitted on the chat. Daryl Bosshart asks, what % of the funding, land acquisition, construction, etc., is paid for by the state, UDOT, versus our local tax dollars of the cities and county?
At this stage, we have not even begun to address what those splits will be. The funding, we do know that the funding can come from a variety of sources, like you pointed out. That could come from the state, that could be local, that could be federal as well. But at this point, we're really not necessarily concerned what those funding sources are, but rather more concerned about just getting through this environmental process and determining that preferred alternative that then could move on to next phases that start looking at those kinds of questions.
Okay. Without any hands raised, we've received another question on the chat from Brian Fletcher. How would construction of the tunnel alternative impact traffic during construction, and for how long? Would it be placed directly under Main Street, or would there be other areas, locations considered for that option?
Get back to that.
I can answer that, Craig, if you want.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and fill that one, Vince? Thanks.
Yeah, I think right now at this phase, we're just looking at whether the tunnel concept works in alleviating traffic, and is it a viable or reasonable alternative? If it does pass screening, the next part of it would be to look exactly where we would place the alternative. We put it on Main Street. It's just the best place right now, but we could look at options to maybe put the tunnel in a slightly different location. Since it's underground, the construction impacts are very minimal. They construct subway tunnels all over the world, under buildings, under streets, that are fully operational, and there's no impact. So I don't know that we're concerned about that. It's just to see if the alternative works. And that was the place just to put the alignment. We could look at different locations.
Thank you, Vince. We'll just do another quick reminder. We've gone through all of the newcomers, if you will, that have raised their hand or asked a question. So we've got a couple of additional questions that have been submitted on the chat from others. If you would like to ask a question, again, raise your virtual hand, either via phone or the app, or go ahead and chat us in to submit comments here, if you would. So Dahlia Gonzalez asked, she said, sorry if I missed this, but is public transportation, future shuttle bus system, for example, being considered for all of the plans? Also, thank you for the work you all do, much appreciated. So question about transit.
Transit, yeah. So one of the alternatives that we are considering is a transit alternative. The recommendations that, and we'll be looking at the recommendations that came out of the transit study that was done back in 2020. I'm trying to flip over to that slide as I'm talking here. Oh, here it is. So there were a number of recommendations that came out of that study that included local services within Heber Valley itself, and then several commuter routes and a van pool service as well. And those are the alternative and those are the recommendations that we'll consider with this alternative.
Thanks, Craig. New question from Phil Jordan. Will there be any opportunity in the EIS process to review comparable cities that have already followed this EIS process, implemented one similar bypass solution, and have conclusions to share with us today, now that the impact can be measured?
I'm gonna ask maybe Vince to maybe answer that question.
We need to look at US 40 on its own merit. It's very hard to find comparables because every city and every region is unique on its own circumstances and how the impacts affect the natural resources, the human environment in different ways. So it's not really a valid to compare one project, how this one turned out versus how this one turned out. It's basically the best option is just to look at the merits of this specific project and the impacts associated with it.
Thank you, Vince. Justin, coming back around to you. If you'd like to come off mute, Justin Crail.
Yeah. My concern is really the cost per mile and the cost per minute. I mean, what are the estimated costs for a Western bypass road?
Right now, we haven't developed those costs. We do start developing those cost alternatives in our screening process when we get to the.
Well, early on, I heard it was like $400 million.
We don't know.
Yeah, Justin,
and then when we
talked about costs earlier,
about the delay per minute from 900 south to 1200 south, if it's an 8-minute delay, I mean, that's almost $100 million cost per minute. I mean, how can you not justify such a cost?
So Justin, that's a great example of what we'd love to hear from you in a written comment during the comment period.
We don't. Well, it's a verbal comment now, and and what do you?
And we've explained that in the future process, we'll look a lot more in detail at costs, and we'd be in a better position to have that conversation at that point.
Well,
so
you're wonderful for even entertaining the idea, but when we're talking $100 or $100 million cost per minute, I mean, think about it.
Yep.
That's all I would say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and the other thing is, I have to say is where it's all about Heber City wants to protect these historic sites on Main Street. How many sites on Main Street have you identified as historic?
Yeah, and that's another element that we'll get into more detail in the further detailed analysis.
I can take a stab at that right now if you want.
Yeah.
Okay, Andrea, chime in.
So if you want to scroll to one of the slides that shows the scroll plots, and I think any of those would work.
That one,
It's,
that one
yep,
helpful.
yep, that works. So it's hard to tell on this screen, but if you went to the website and you went to the alternatives tab, you could go to a section that shows the scroll plots. And if you clicked on any one of those, there's three, US 40, West Alternative, or East Alternative, then you could zoom in and look at it in more detail. The red dots that are shown on that scroll plot are really hard to see on this screen, but they're there, and they represent preliminarily what we've identified as potential historic buildings. And so you can go ahead and zoom in on there and get an idea of how many at this point we think there are. But I do want to put in the caveat that it's preliminary information that we have from available databases, like the State Historic Preservation Office has data that we've acquired, and that's what we're showing here. So we'll use this data for screening. And after we go through the screening process, we'll go to more effort to identify which buildings meet the criteria for eligibility on the National Register of Historic Places. So these dots signify a starting point. We still have more work to do, which we'll do after the screening process when we narrow down the alternatives a little bit more.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how many hundreds of millions of dollars we have to pay for 2 blocks, essentially, of historic Main Street. And my view is, have you seen 189 through Provo? It's been done beautifully. I mean, we did not have to run bypass UDOT National Highways or US Highways through Provo. We maintained US Highway 189 through Provo. Why can't we do that through Heber? And I would hope UDOT would consider this alternative. I mean, I drive down through 189 through Provo, and I think it's beautiful. And you guys have done a magnificent job. And I would hope you consider doing the same thing through Heber.
Thank you, Justin.
Well,
we've got to move on to a couple of additional written comments. So thank you for chiming in. We've got a question from Brady Flygare. He says the Sorensen property with a projected 8,000 homes has been annexed into Heber City. What studies have been done to take into account the impact of the future traffic moving from north of Heber? Is that maybe a Charles question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question. So in doing our traffic analysis for 2050 conditions, we took into account growth in the Sorensen area, in addition to other projected growth throughout the Heber Valley and even areas outside of the Heber Valley. So it was one of many potential developments that we've considered in our projections for 2050 traffic volumes.
Thank you, Charles. We have a question from a new submitter on Facebook. Can you explain more about the turbo roundabouts? Will they be safe for semi-trailers to travel through? My understanding is a major goal of the bypass is to get the semis off Main Street. Will roundabouts be a safe alternative for these trucks? I know, Charles, you've spoken to this a little bit already. We do have links, I will say, in the chat that point to resources about these turbo roundabouts. But Charles, would you like to expand, or GF, I say you come off mute. Would you like to weigh in?
I just think so. There are some examples of not the turbo style roundabout, but there are roundabouts where semis do successfully navigate it, and you can find those down in St. George at Brigham Drive at that interchange, where they do have roundabouts there. So the roundabout, going back to what Charles had mentioned before, roundabouts can be designed and built to accommodate semis, should that be an option.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything more to add to that, other than turbo roundabouts are a design coming from Europe. There's some safety and capacity benefits that they claim to have over other roundabout designs. The benefits of a turbo roundabout are something we're definitely going to consider in detail for that particular alternative.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have another question from Phil Jordan. He says, within the level 2 screening criteria, where is the measurement of impact to adjacent residential properties in terms of noise, night sky, change of vehicle access, and safety of pedestrians, non-residential? Andrea, is it maybe that a question for you or someone else?
Yeah, sure. I take a stab at that. So we don't look at impacts to all resources in level 2 screening. The resources that you mentioned, like noise, access, I think you mentioned several more, all of those will be evaluated in detail in the DEIS for the alternatives that pass through screening. The reason that we chose the level 2 screening criteria that we did is because there are laws that protect waters of the US in Section 4F resources. Section 4F resources include public parks, recreation facilities, and historic places. So those were selected as level 2 screening criteria because the laws are so strong that protect them that UDOT is required to pick alternatives that avoid them unless there's no real alternative. And so the reason that we look at those is that they have a higher level of protection, but we look at everything else that you mentioned for the alternatives that pass through in detail. And it would take a lot of time and a lot of money to look at everything at level 2 screening. And it's just not efficient for us to get through the process if we looked at everything. But the intent is that we do need to look at everything in detail that passes through the screening process. And I hope that answers your question. If not, please let me know if I can clarify.
Thank you, Andrea. Anything from the team that you'd like to add on? Okay. I'll put out one more quick call. If you'd like to ask a new question, feel free to raise your hand, chat us. We have one more question that's been submitted by Brian Fletcher. He asked earlier about the tunnel, and in response, he said, "Thank you. I see the tunnel as a win-win. There is minimal impact on traffic during construction, no neighborhood disruptions, few to no intersections needed, reduces noise pollution in the valley, can reduce air pollution through air filtration in the tunnel, and increase safety for pedestrians and bikers on existing roads." So just a follow-up statement to the answer received. Thanks, Brian. So as of this moment, we have responded to the questions that have been submitted in writing, either via Facebook or the chat. We've responded to the hands that have been raised thus far. Are there any other final questions anybody wants to submit online, or questions to raise via a live appearance, if you will? Maybe while you mull on that, and to give everybody just another minute or two to think or weigh in, chime in, I'll cover a couple of other items. Many of you heard this already, some of you did not. We have an attendance sign-in sheet. It helps us with tracking for our public involvement activities. It also is a record, an official record of who was here and participated. We'll post that in the chat here, and we would invite you to link over to that sign-in sheet and provide your information. It will provide us an opportunity to stay in touch with you moving forward, as well as be a record of who is here tonight. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we've been recording the meeting. It'll be posted and available on the website. And another reminder, as we've talked here, we've heard a mix of questions and statements or comments that people wanted to make. We would just encourage you again and again to make those comments formal via one of the methods that we've provided on the website. So that can be submitted via an email to the project email address, a phone call, and leave us a voicemail that we'll transcribe into the record. You can send us a snail mail letter if you prefer that. The address to send to is also available on the website. And there's maybe the simplest would be just a public comment form right there embedded in the website. So as I've been chatting, there have been a couple of additions that have come in. I know that there's also been resources that Bree has been posting, a link to the the public meeting sign in, as well as the contact information that allows you to submit a comment to us. Phil Jordan, could you clarify one solution moving forward in terms of the west-east bypass and Main Street alternatives?
So if I understand the
Someone from the team?
question, is there a west bypass alternative that's preferred, or a Main Street alternative preferred at this point? The answer is no. Right now, all the alternatives are being considered, and then we'll take them through that screening process that we talked about earlier tonight. And each of those alternatives will be evaluated based on that screening criteria, and the alternatives that pass through that screening process will then be moved on to the further and fuller evaluation in the draft EIS process.
I see Phil came off mute. He may want to clarify for himself.
Yeah, hi, can you all hear me? Thank you very much. This has been amazing. And thanks for the response. I guess my question is, there's so much here. Is it in the realm of possibility that there is some hybrid of one bypass solution from the west, in addition to one solution from the east, in addition to a Main Street alternative? That's my question, because I could construe that of these 13, I believe there are 13, only one is moving forward, and I just want to clarify that.
I know, Andrea, you kind of answered this a little earlier on in the meeting. Do you want to kind of restate what you spoke about earlier?
Yeah, I think 2 points. One is what Naomi said earlier, is that we want to come out of this process with one preferred alternative. And I think what you might be asking is, can that one preferred alternative include a west bypass and east bypass and improvements to 40? If I'm understanding you right?
That's correct.
You never say never. I would think that it's unlikely that we would have an alternative that would include all three components. I think that it's more likely that we're going to have one or the other. But that's not to say that we aren't going to be looking at the alternatives, refining them, and that they could change. It's very likely that these alternatives will change as we develop them in more detail. I would invite other people on the project team to add to that as well.
Yeah, I think you eventually get to this point where you've solved the problem. You lose, if you have too many components with one alternative, you get to this point where it's no longer benefiting the problem you're trying to solve. Eventually, it gets to the point that you just disperse the traffic so much that you're expending a lot more funds on alternatives that add a little additional benefit. So it's likely that, when you start looking at the cost factor, that using or selecting one alternative makes sense because it meets your purpose, and there's a cost associated with one project. If you start adding on additional projects, you add substantial cost, and you get impacts associated with that, but not getting any additional benefit in meeting your purpose and need. So it doesn't make sense to start to do that and have a lot more impacts. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that clearly with all of this, I mean, we've heard a lot of concern about public investment. Clearly, we also talked about a pretty remarkable outcome that we're looking for. I mean, being part of the historic Main Street and understanding that, Heber City envisioned 2050 to make it a walkable, essentially, zone of engagement with community and tourism. Changing it from a highway is obviously with the bypass.
Have you guys ever seen Heber Main Street? It's like car dealerships, gas stations, and fast food restaurants. There's like 2 blocks of historical Main Street. And
Justin, we want to make sure that we respect Phil. He had the floor at the moment, so let's let Phil conclude.
I was able to chime in. You can mute me, but
Well, so
ahead,
all I
Phil.
really wanted to understood was that if there is a hybrid combination that bypasses on the east and the west,
They muted me.
leaving Main Street as it is that still in the realm of possibility as a solution moving forward was my question, but I think you've answered it. So great, thank you.
Okay. We have received another, looks like these are more comments from Gwen Denise. And
I'm kicked out, huh?
okay, so I also like the idea of the tunnel. Thank you. And then she also says, it would appear that with the continued growth, both east and west bypass roads may be necessary, similar to the parkways built in St. George. So kind of another comment along the lines of, would there be multiple alternatives moved forward? So any additional comment from the team on that point?
I think, again, it's just that, you know, if you start looking at additional alternative or combo of alternatives, you're also doubling the impacts and other things. And those things we would have to consider in looking at multiple concepts, as well as the cost, and are you getting any additional benefit by having all that?
Okay. All right. Not seeing additional hands raised. We have not received additional comments or questions at this time. So what I want to do is put out one more time a request for those who are interested in asking a question or making a comment to raise your hand. Justin, if you've got something new to comment on or to ask, we'd love to hear from you. So I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. But
well,
if you also would like to, if you'd like, just give me a minute. If you would like to, you can also go ahead and chat in your question, put it on Facebook. And a reminder that we'll be in person at the elementary school tomorrow, Heber Elementary, from 5 to 8. And all of this same information is what will be available there. There won't be new information. There won't be a formal presentation. It will be an opportunity to review the same information and have a conversation with individually with some of the team members if you'd like, or if you feel like you've been able to get your questions answered here tonight, we would love for you to share the opportunity with those in your various circles, professional, personal, or otherwise, so that we can have good engagement from the community. So that's another opportunity tomorrow night. Also, once we have this kind of packaged up from tonight's meeting, we'll post it on the website as well. That said, it's 7:30. We are going to stay online until 8 so that we make sure that maybe somebody that was running late and wanted to ask a particular question can join us, at 7:45 and still have an audience with the team. So, but if you have, kind of satisfied your questions and the information that you were seeking, you're welcome to sign off at this point, as we've covered the material and we've responded to all of the questions submitted thus far. We did get a message from Phil. Thanks for the remarkable quantity and quality of work. See you tomorrow at the public meeting. Thank you for that. Okay, so with that, Justin, have you got a new question or comment to make for us? Justin, maybe you didn't, maybe you've.
Oh, okay, I'm here. Justin, Craig, and Andrea. I just wanted to comment, number one, on the outstanding job that you have done to let the citizens have the perception that you're listening to us. I mean, this is a complete about face, and we're so happy for this. And then number one, I would really love to have the financial breakdown on really what the taxpayer cost is for the the western bypass, and then how we can actually, we could literally improve Heber Main Street to make this a beautiful thing for everybody. I mean, what UDOT has done through Provo with 189 should be a model for Heber City. I drive down 189, and you have done a remarkable job. So like I said, I want to compliment Justin, Craig, and Andrea on actually giving us the impression you're listening to us and opening up some other options besides just running freaking freeways through our eastern and western fields. And
okay, Justin, thank you for your comment. We've got another person that wants to weigh in. Jeff Hill.
Yeah,
please
thanks.
go ahead.
I have a question on the western bypass. And you may have covered this. I apologize, I haven't been on the whole night, but there's the one that starts up at the intersection north of town. The
WD alternative.
Yeah, why is there two? Are the two options the one that comes off of Potter Lane and then also the one that comes out of the River Road? Is it one or the other, or is that both?
No, this alternative has both of those connections being made. So it's not one or the other. This alternative would go with both of those connections, the one at Potter Lane and the one at River Road.
Okay. Is there some reasoning as to why you'd have two funneling to the same route?
You know, this was an alternative that we received from a member of the public. We haven't really evaluated it based on the traffic. If this one passes through some of that screening, we'll take a look at it and see, you know, from at least from a traffic perspective, whether or not both connections are needed or just one. So at this point, like I say, we haven't really evaluated from a traffic perspective.
And is the turbo roundabouts only offered in this route? Is this something that also came from whoever the person was from the public that brought this up?
Yes, it came as part of that. It came specifically as part of that alternative.
Have they been used anywhere else in Utah?
I'm not aware of where they're being used anywhere else in Utah. Okay. We know that they're used in Europe. We have a couple links down in the chat that point to that, but we're not aware of anything in Utah that they use this
time. I looked up online and couldn't see them. Looked like they were just used in a couple countries in Europe.
Right.
And Jeff, if you joined recently, that link may not be in your chat. Bree or Andrea, would you mind throwing that in the chat a second time so that Jeff for sure has access to that? Charles, I also noted you came off mute. Did you want to respond to the question about the roundabouts?
Yeah, just a little bit more detail. A turbo element or turbo roundabout is comprised of multiple elements that make it a little bit different than the roundabouts we're used to seeing. There are some roundabouts in Utah that have some of the turbo roundabout elements, but not all.
Okay. Do you mind if I ask one more question? Is anyone else waiting?
Not at the moment. Please continue.
On the eastern side, is part of the study part of the positive benefit of that side alleviating so much of the growth that right now is kind of funneled to Center Street and 12th South? Is that part? I mean, we have the bypass option for obviously for traffic coming through the valley, but is the study also take into account the traffic that's coming from, you know, the east side, from Timber Lakes, from Lake Creek Farms? Is all that weigh into that? I mean, clearly that's part of the traffic, or is the bypass just considering the tankers and the traffic that's coming from either North 40 or Highway I guess Highway 89 doesn't really impact much, but.
So the eastern bypass does consider both the through traffic and the local traffic in these alternatives. Charles, I don't know if there's probably more you'd want to add to that, but it does look at all the traffic in that area.
Yeah, the way these alternatives are defined right now is they're open to any vehicle that wants to drive on them.
Sure.
And in our traffic modeling, we're taking into account the travel patterns for the entire valley. So we're investigating how much they would be used by any type of trip within the valley.
So it could be assumed that there's kind of a double bonus to the east side scenario. An advantage from because you're I mean, I guess that's a problem. Is that a problem that UDOT looks at the inner city, Center Street, 12th South scenario? Is that weighted at all, or is it more just about the bypass?
Well, I think I would point back to the purpose and need of the study, which is really focused on improving conditions on Main Street. So
it would help.
Some of these.
Help that. Yeah.
Yeah, there may be some ancillary benefits to various alternatives, but the evaluation of the alternatives is really going to focus on how much do they help Main Street.
But I think this is Vince. I think you bring in a point that yes, it could help Main Street because those people going further east of the bypass, for example, may not take Main Street, right? So it alleviates traffic on Main Street. But the same thing could be said too for the west side. People going to Midway, for example, instead of coming into town and going onto 113, they would take the bypass and avoid using Main Street. So all that is figured in on how the alternative improves Main Street itself, because now we're getting a lot of that other kind of local traffic off of Main Street and going around town to get to their destination.
Okay. One last question. This one, I don't know if you guys are going to be able to answer, but I'm really curious. If you were to guess, when do you think there would be one of these bypasses built? Just if we were just throwing it out there, how fast do you think this process will go based upon what you've seen in other communities, or do you have any guess?
I don't. It's really, there's so many factors that fall into that. Really, our team is focused on just getting through this big step, and then the next steps can begin to happen, and that's as far as my crystal ball can take me.
All right. I was just curious. I know it's been a hot topic for years, so.
It sure has.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Jeff. And I'll note, we did get, again, we're super pleasing. Bree and Andrea both posted the links to the FHWA information about the roundabouts. So it's there in duplicate if for anybody that would like to access that. We did get a follow-up from Denise Gwen. It was a kind post. Again, thank you for the professional presentation. Thank you for weighing in. Again, so we're sitting at 7:40. We will stay online until 8. So if anybody has additional questions, feel free to chat them into us or raise your hand. Do another reminder of the sign-in sheet and another reminder of the comment period itself. So that starts today and it runs through the 4th of November, and all comments would need to be received by then. I believe if they're coming in postmarked, and I'll look at Andrea, our process expert here, that they can need to be postmarked by the 4th, but we could receive them a day or two later. So
that's right.
Great. And again, you can submit comments a number of ways, and we'll be in Heber tomorrow night with bells on to talk with those that want to come and chat in person. I suppose if there aren't additional comments, I know Craig has a great song and dance routine that he could do for us. I'm totally kidding.
I'm sure glad.
I think you guys should tackle the hot topic of where the temple is going to be located in Heber Valley.
Yeah, everybody just weigh in, pick a location, and we'll see who got it
Pure
right.
Speculation. We have no idea.
Oh, I thought that would weigh into this.
We don't even want to begin to go there.
No, you probably.
Maybe while we've got a minute, I'll just throw the opportunity open to our project team, our study team. Any additional clarifications, comments, anything that I've missed in moderating what we want to remind folks of? I see Andrea came off mute. Maybe chime in,
I do have
please.
one. So I've heard a couple of comments about people just saying, well, when's a bypass going to be? How long is it going to take? And I just want to remind everybody that we don't know that it will be a bypass at this point, that we're looking at alternatives that could be a bypass or alternatives that could improve US 40, but we really don't know at this point. I just wanted to make that comment.
Good reminder. Thanks, Andrea. Geoff, you see you came off mute also.
Yeah, just want to remind those who are in attendance and those who may be listening to this or watching this after the fact that this will be posted online. The entire presentation, as well as or the entire meeting, as well as the presentation itself. So if you miss something, you'll have plenty of time to go back and review, so that we want to make sure that everybody has as much opportunity as they can to take advantage of the information that's been provided tonight, that'll be provided tomorrow, as well as throughout the comment period. Once this is posted, we'll keep this up throughout that comment period, and most likely throughout the project until we get to the point where we are moving into that next phase of in the draft environmental phase, when we get back out to the public as we go through this refining process.
Great reminders. Thank you, Jeff. So we've got a submitted comment, and Sue Ellen has raised her hand. So Sue Ellen, why don't you take yourself off mute and weigh in?
Hi, thanks. I just had one quick question. So looking back, I remember there was UDOT was attempting to widen 248 going from Highway 40 into Park City. And there was a huge outcry in the local, population that they did not want to cut into the mountain, and they were not interested in having that widening take place. And eventually, as I understand it, UDOT backed down and did not force that on to the people. So I was just wondering, are we looking at any kind of a similar situation here, that if there were enough of a public outcry against building into a highway through the North Fields, or building a highway through, neighborhoods or whatever, or you know what I mean? I'm just saying, is there a point where, or is this going to happen no matter what? Is something going to happen no matter what? Or is there still a chance that, the public outcry might outweigh what UDOT might be trying to do? And then I had asked that of someone in the community leadership, and I was told that it was actually UDOT. This was not your dream. It was Heber city leadership that had recruited UDOT to come in and do something. So I'm just kind of wondering if you can sort that out as well, or set me straight, because I don't know what's actually the truth in that.
Thanks, Sue Ellen.
Vince, maybe this is one that you can field for us. So I come off mute there.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics of 248 and Park City and what happened there, but the reason UDOT is starting this process is because there's a problem that needs to be addressed, and we go through the environmental process to find a solution. The no action is always on the table. UDOT could select the no action if they decided to, but the reason we're doing this project is to find a solution and hopefully find an alternative that can solve it and then implement that. Most of the time when UDOT goes through this process, they do select an alternative, and when funding becomes available, depending where the project is on a priority list, they usually get implemented. But again, I'll reiterate that the no action is always on the table. And we do evaluate the no action alternative as a baseline.
And so how did this, thank you, I appreciate that. How did this come to be? Was it community leadership that reached out to UDOT saying we've got a problem? Or does UDOT just kind of drive around and see where problems are and decide we need to do something, remediate?
No, you know, I wasn't around personally when this project was first brought to us, but my understanding is that community leaders did reach out to UDOT and request that UDOT take over this process that we're going through right now. I don't know, maybe Jeff, you were around during that time. Maybe you can add to that as well.
Yeah, that's correct. Several community leaders did have discussions with not only our regional office, but with our central office, and had some of those conversations, and actually met with our transportation commission in a public meeting and requested as a part of requesting the funding to that this study be funded, because it will help with their planning efforts within the county and the communities within this part of the valley. And so there has been a lot of discussion back and forth between the community leadership and the department, which is what really drove this forward.
I want to add that though the project to make an improvement on 40 has been in the long range plans, and there's an identified need in those plans that something should be done. So it's been in the planning process for a while that there's a need. The community came out and said, we know there's a need to do this. Can you guys go ahead and start that process? So it wasn't just like the community came out and said, well, we think there's a problem here, fix it. It was identified in the long range plans as having a problem. The community just said, could you go ahead and bring that up on the list to start that evaluation process?
Yeah, and those conversations, to what Vince was saying, those conversations have been ongoing for years, which allowed it to get onto which got it onto their plan as part of their plans, and it's just taken time to go through those other incremental steps to get to this point.
Thank you very much.
Naomi, did you have something you wanted to add? And then we have a question that's coming online.
I think it was covered, so thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Sue Ellen. The question from Gwen Denise, or probably Denise Gwen, I'm guessing, and if I've got that wrong, I apologize. Do you know where the biggest population growth is predicted? Midway growth, Heber growth? This may also help determine which bypass would be more useful.
I think we do have some of the growth numbers that we look at. I don't know if they're granular enough to know where which side of the valley that growth is coming from or when. But we obviously do look at growth as part of our analysis.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that, Craig, that in the modeling, travel modeling, we look at new developments that are proposed that we know of that are proposed between now and 2050. So we do take into account where that growth is expected and how it would affect each of the different alternatives. You know, for example, we know there's going to be a lot of growth north of Heber on the east side of 40. There's a big development, and that's included in our model. So we do account for the future growth in the modeling that we do.
Charles, I also saw you come off mute. Would you like to weigh in also?
Vince said it very well. I don't have anything more to add.
Okay. Anything else the project team would like to kind of re-emphasize or weigh in with?
I've got one more. This is just a reminder that the comments and questions we're getting tonight in this meeting are great and they're helpful, but but we do want everyone to submit comments through the official means, which would be website, email, snail mail, or telephone message. Those are the methods that we capture comments that will be recorded in the alternatives methodology and screening report. So verbal comments are great in this meeting, but please submit them officially.
Thanks, Andrea. I know some of you that started with us from 4:55 have heard several of these things a number of times. We appreciate your patience on that. And I'll note that Bree has posted in the chat a link to some information that's about the traffic modeling and conditions that was done in the prior phase. That will be helpful to those of you who might have questions about traffic flows and traffic numbers, information there that the study team has put together. Craig, are you still in control of the presentation?
I am.
Would you mind maybe jumping to that study process graphic? I think it's the second to last slide. I think it's, you know, I know that folks in the transportation space can get very used to how these things unfold. And I know that from the public side, it can be less familiar. And so I was just going to walk through this one more time, but we did have a new question come in via Facebook. So we'll jump to that since that's what this time is for. From Heidi Ward Harmon, do the east side routes include roads that Red Ledges is already obligated to pay for? If so, it would save the taxpayers a lot of money. That's a good question. I'm not sure who might have the best answer to that on the team.
Not exactly knowing where the roads of Red Ledges is being built, but just to kind of reiterate that the alternatives that we are using on the East Bypass does follow to a certain degree this East Bypass road that is currently being built for much of this alignment. It does deviate a little bit in this one section where it curves around and heads back to 40, but you know, much of this may already be built once we actually get a project funded if one of these alternatives were to be selected.
Thanks, Craig. Anyone else on the team want to weigh in on that? Okay. So maybe we're at 7:55, 54, 55. We'll just to walk through this process. Many of you participated in the early phases of this, the stuff on the left-hand side. You know, our early scoping activities where we had a comment period, and many of you weighed in then, and that helped us develop the purpose and need, which will kind of be the bar against which these alternatives that you've heard about tonight will be measured against, including the screening criteria that's also been described. And so that public process led us to now, and the alternatives are in front of the public. Now we need to hear from you about, did we miss something? Are there new ideas? Are there adjustments that need to be made? And that will help us then go through another refining process, that level of screening that Andrea has spoken to, that will winnow the alternatives hopefully down to a set that we can dive into a little more deeply. And as we do that, we'll start to prepare that draft EIS that will be put out in summer fall timeframe next year for an additional round of public review. Those of you that have been with us the whole night know that we talked about that a little bit, that this is not certainly the only time you have to weigh in on these alternatives. That said, this is an important time for you to weigh in on these alternatives. But a shortened list, hopefully, of alternatives will be included in the draft EIS, and we'll have a public hearing at that point. There'll be a 45-day public comment period that'll help us further refine and perhaps head toward a preferred alternative, which would be prepared and put forward in a final EIS. You can kind of see that timeline unfold, the opportunities there will be for public engagement between now and then. Some of them will be, live interactions, live meaning either via Zoom like this, depending on health conditions, or, in person at the elementary school like we'll do tomorrow night. But there will be more opportunities to engage, but this is an important opportunity to engage. So as Andrea has reminded us, please share your comments, share the information about the open house tomorrow night at the elementary school. And, we're here toward the end now. Craig, maybe I'll pass it back to you for any parting words that you have, and we can probably wrap up.
Sounds good. Thanks, Justin. No, I just want to reiterate once again our appreciation for all of you sticking with us tonight and being a part of this process. We know how important this project is to your community, and that's not lost on us. And we want to do the right thing. We're committed to following our NEPA process and finding the solution that would best solve the problems that we've identified in our purpose statement, and that's the least impactful. And so once again, thank you for taking the time to be a part of the process and to be here tonight. And once again, if you have comments, please make those comments in one of the various means that we've provided, so that we can capture those comments officially in the official record. So that's really all I think that I have to add. I don't know, Justin or the team, if we don't have any more comments, we can probably wrap this up and look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow night at the school as well.
Thanks, Craig, and thanks everybody.
Okay. Sounds good. Good night, everyone.